Welcome to the Revitivist podcast, your gateway to the ultimate celebration of well-being and vitality. I'm your host, Karen Thompson, and I am thrilled to take you on a journey that aims to educate, excite, and energize. Today, we are incredibly honored to welcome Robb Wolf, a luminary in the fields of health, wellness, and regenerative agriculture. Robb is not only a best-selling author of 3 groundbreaking books, but he's also the founder of Element, a company dedicated to optimizing individual health and performance. As a former research biochemist, Robb brings one of the most intelligent and thoughtful voices to the health and wellness space. He has been pivotal in transforming our understanding of how diet, lifestyle, and environmental factors intersect. His comprehensive and science-backed approach doesn't just focus on personal well-being, it encompasses the ecological impact of our daily choices. Robb's recent work has been instrumental in raising both awareness and education levels on how food choices can be a lever for positive environmental change. He effortlessly bridges the gap between personal health and ecological responsibility, compelling us all to think more conscientiously about the choices we make. In addition to his many phenomenal roles, Robb is also a featured speaker at the upcoming Revitivest event, a festival committed to revitalizing both individual well-being and helping you find your very own blueprint for health. You can visit us at revitivest.com to buy tickets. But before we go there, I am so excited to welcome Robb to the Revitivest podcast. I have so many questions and topics I want to dive into with you today, but I'll start by just saying welcome. It is such an honor to have you here.
Thank you. That's possibly the best introduction I've ever had. I should be taller than 5'9" with a resume and an introduction like that. Thank you.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, my first question is super basic, but I know you're going to have a wonderful definition. And that is the question I'm asking all the guests. That is, what is health? What is your definition of health?
You know, mine is probably going to be geekier than a lot of folks, and I can send this paper to you, but maybe 12 years ago, the journal Nature had a piece that was the hallmarks of cancer. And they basically had these different categories of what went into cancer, what propagated cancer, what cancer actually is, and all this type of stuff. And then it was about 2 years ago that they had this fascinating paper that described the hallmarks of health. And this is kind of an interesting thing within medicine, that health has never really had a proper definition. Typically, health is like the absence of disease, and that's not really what it is when you get right down to it. And so broadly, they had this, and it's really a beautiful paper and very, very accessible for folks. Lots of nice graphics and everything, but there's kind of 8 different categories, and a lot of it involves cellular integrity. So, like the integrity of the cell, the integrity of the individual, the integrity of the gut, and then communication and adaptability. And really, what we had boiled it down to is a resilience and integrity is really what this boils down to. And for Element, the electrolyte company I'm involved with, this is actually what we have used as our guiding principles for the company. Usually, people have this kind of like pie in the sky thing of we aspire to and do this, that, and the other. But really, what we've done is use these hallmarks of health as our guideposts for how to operate the business, because I feel like this is kind of a fractal story that if an organism is healthy, if a cell is healthy, then there's things that you learn from that applies to a multicellular organism and to a society and to a world. And really, integrity is this thing that is basically, you want certain things in, you want certain things out. You don't want to be hermetically sealed. That isn't life. But you also, if you strip the cell membrane away from a cell, it's not really alive anymore. It's just completely open to the environment, and effectively it's dead. And then you have to be able to adapt. You have to be resilient. That is basically what resilience is. Resilience is this process in which a system, whether it's an economy or our immune system, it gets stressed and then it adapts, and then it gets better as a consequence of that stress. That's really what resilience is. So this is kind of my long-winded definition of health, and I'd be happy to share this paper with you. It really, I think there's so much to be learned from this, and it's so valuable for medicine and health and broadly, because it really does put some very brass tacks parameters around this. It is not soft, fuzzy definitions. And when you look at the issues that people face with regards to health, permeable gut, permeable brain, like we're now learning that maybe all these neurodegenerative diseases start in the gut, like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. God damn, it's got a lot of impact. Like it's really, really important. So that's my long-winded deal around what health is. And I really am benchmarking it around this paper, The Hallmarks of Health.
That is absolutely mind blowing, and I would love for you to share that paper with us. You gave me so much more than I was expecting, so I'm very very grateful.
Awesome.
You
We're off to a
mentioned
good start.
yeah, no, that was a stellar definition. It really goes up there with my introduction to you, really. Anyway, so I would love to know how you were talking about how you implement these concepts of resilience and integrity into Element. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, geez. When we run a business these days, and both you and I have experience with CrossFit, and
Yeah,
CrossFit has this front facing persona, and then it has the back office piece, and there's all kinds of interesting stuff, associated with that. But you have to kind of figure out who you are and what you stand for, and to what degree you decide to be adaptable, and to what degree you decide to not be adaptable. In my mind, hopefully you're always quite adaptable, and as evidence presents itself, or like stresses are introduced into a system, then you've got a reasonable response to that. And so what we have done within Element, as kind of our guiding North Star, and I have to give huge props to our COO, Brianna Sigerson. She saw this integrity and resilience. She's like, those are great, but she felt like there was something that was like a bridge or a center. If we had Venn diagrams, what would be the middle of integrity and resilience? And she came up with this idea of sovereignty, like self sovereignty. And I was like, oh, of course it is. Like, this is brilliant. So we've had some dust ups with, different things that have popped up on social media. It's very difficult to have any type of an opinion or thought about anything, related to like social topics and,
yep,
and all that type of stuff, and not get on the bad side of somebody. But what's been really interesting is whenever we're faced with kind of an internal challenge, we go back to this hallmarks of health, and we start at sovereignty of the individual. And then we start working forward about integrity, and letting the right things in, keeping the wrong things out, and really having a pretty steadfast position on that. But then also understanding that if you can't deal with stressful inputs and grow and adapt and be resilient, you're going to die. You're going to make a decision that's going to kill you, and not to drive this thing off of a cliff. But I think that's what Greg Glassman ended up ultimately doing during the early stages of COVID, very
yeah,
unadaptable, very not resilient, and made
yeah,
decisions that ultimately, direly impacted him and CrossFit. And
yeah,
so
yeah.
I learned as much about that scene, what not to do, I think, as what to do. There were lots and lots of I think, interesting lessons there. But this is kind of our guiding light, the way that we use these things. And again, there are these 8 different subtopics, about like cellular communication and different things like
Yeah,
that we really try to lean into to think about, okay, how are we structuring our company, how are we communicating with each other, how are we having this integrity? And I mean, knock on wood, but it has been working really well. And when I stepped back from this, I like, what are other examples of this? And the Savory Institute, which Alan Savory is this kind of icon in the regenerative ag scene, he and other folks in that scene have developed this thing called holistic management. And really, holistic management is this thing of, it's very similar to this. It doesn't use exactly the same kind of terminology and nomenclature and whatnot, but when I stepped back and looked for similar examples, like this is very similar because holistic management sits down and basically says, well, what do you value? What do you want as an outcome? And then how do we work backwards from that? And for Alan, thinking about like preventing desertification, like using grazing animals to promote grasslands to push back the desert and actually reclaim arable land masses instead of going forward. But they arrived at that by using this holistic management model of trying to figure out what is the outcome you want, and then how do we work backwards in a way that we get all of these you get multi-dimensional things happening all at once. So if you properly use grazing animals, you get more grass, you get more insects, you get more bugs, you get more birds, you get more life generally. The ground holds more water. It doesn't get as hot. It sequesters more carbon. And so, if you do this one thing right, you get like 30 different knock on effects that are all beneficial in this direction. So, this holistic management, and I think this kind of picture of the hallmarks of health are these things that I think are really valuable, and not to pat ourselves on the back too much, but I look around at most of what I see in the rest of business and like healthcare and whatnot. I just don't see anything like that. It's kind of like this Harvard Business School kind of take on the way to do things, and that's okay, but it's really not holistic. It's really not looking at endpoints that aren't strip mining the system that you're in, that actually makes it better because you're there. And so that's much of the stuff that we try to employ doing this. And we're 5 years old, so I mean we're still wet behind the ear, babes at this stuff, but I'm optimistic that we'll really be able to have a profound impact in the broader health space because of this orientation.
Rob, I'm blown away. I really am. I mean, like my head's kind of just going a million miles an hour because the concept of health that you've just explained, these hallmarks of health, they transcend every boundary of health that we understand, right? We can apply it to the individual, the collective,
Yep.
business, governments, everything. And then we can, employ it within the individual space to mental, physical, spiritual, all types of health and everything that we talk about. So just coming back to the beautiful thing about really understanding your values and what drives you and your business and the way you conduct yourself everywhere, now that you've explained it to me, makes a ton of
That's
sense.
cool.
I can see this in the way that you are putting yourself out to the world.
That's cool. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, it's an experiment. It may work great for some period of time, and then we may be a footnote in history. I mean, there's no guarantee of any of that stuff, but at a minimum, it's been successful so far, and it's felt really good. Like even we ask a lot of our teammates, but as part of this part of life works in cycles, and the way that a startup works, it's there's not really much cycle to it. It's just go and then go more and then go harder, and burnout, suicide. Like Nikki was a co-founder of a tech company, and I think last count 6 members of this initial like founding group have committed suicide over time. And I mean these are young people who are already probably wealthier than like 95% of people in the world, but for whatever reason, like they get so fucked up with the stuff they have going on and the kind of toxic environment of startup culture, like that's where they end up. But we do things in 3-week sprints where we've got a defined goal or task that we're working on, and we'll ask for as much help as we need and like really reach out and do things. But then we have a 1 week rest and assess. And you're not like 100% off, but you're way disconnected. And really, what you're supposed to do is step back and then look at this thing from the outside. What am I doing? So get out of answering emails every 5 minutes and doing the usual thing, and step back and look at this thing and reassess, figure out your successes, figure out your failures, figure out where you need some help, and then you plug back in and you're recharged again. And like people do intervals. I mean, it's interval training, but with a
Yeah.
work environment, and almost anybody can do almost anything for like a 3-week block. Like they can just fucking work like crazy, when you've got that thing, okay, I've got my rest and assess week. I'll be able to unplug. I'll be able to relax. I'll spend more time with family. I'll focus on my gardening. And a lot of what we encourage people to do is to have like their personal thing that they're doing, whether it's like a social topic or their family or whatever, and like really plug in and engage with that. And what we've found is that people are profoundly proficient or uh, uh, productive with that. Like they get a lot done and they come back in and they're charged up and they get a bunch of new ideas. Like they're doing things that aren't just business and it's not just a grind. And you're thinking back and you're like, I can't even remember the last 6 months because it's just this gray miasma of like the same stuff. So it tends to break things up. It changes all that stuff. And again, time will tell whether or not that's a good idea, and you can't always do that with everything. Like how would you do that in a restaurant? How would you do that in a daycare center or something? Like I'm not entirely sure. Like a more like in your face brick and mortar setting, I think that there could be ways to do that, to pull
Yeah,
people out and have them do something different and then plug them back in.
yeah,
But so far it's been really good, and like we have found really high quality people and we get amazing productivity out of them. And we don't have people burning out. We don't have people killing themselves. Like if they're over a barrel and they're kind of like, I need help, then we get them help. And we have, again, that hallmarks of health. The critical feature
yeah,
there is really direct, honest communication, and really no quarter is offered on that front, because if things aren't going right, we need to know that now, not later. Because the worse the situation gets, the harder it is to fix it. So I mean that's
yeah.
been the stuff that we've done. And again, like I'm very proud of it. I'm very excited about it, but I've seen enough things be successful and then flame out and die that I'm not so hoity, big in my britches, that I think that we've got it all figured out. Like it's kind of it's always looking for the other shoe to drop. But again, like so far so good with it all.
Absolutely. We're cautiously optimistic. I mean, going back, you have, I mean, you've had the most profound impact. I mean, the Paleo Solution was published in 2010,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And you had Wired to Eat in 2017, and then Sacred Cow with Diana Rogers, which was a book and a documentary in 2020. I mean, your trajectory has been incredible, and the work that you've put out has been profoundly life changing for a lot of people. But I wonder, what are the biggest lessons that you learned from each one of those experiences?
Man, that's a great question.
And we can go one by one,
Yeah,
because I think
you know,
Paleo Solution.
the Paleo Solution was interesting in that. So I got into all of this because of a personal health crisis that occurred in the late 90s, like mid to late 90s. I developed ulcerative colitis so bad that I nearly died from it. Like I'm 170 pounds. I'm 5'9", 170 pounds. I'm not a big guy. I was 125 pounds at the low ebb of my ulcerative colitis. So if you imagine 50 pounds less of me,
No.
there wasn't much there, and I nearly died from it. And so when I and it's kind of a long story how the idea of ancestral eating got on my radar, and I tried it, and it was profoundly beneficial for me. I was looking at either an MD or an MD PhD track at that time. I was doing bench research at the Fred Hutch Cancer Research Center. And when I had this health transformation, I was just like, I can't do 4 years of medical school, 4 years of residency, and all the paperwork and kind of bullshit to get out to try to just help people. And this is where just a couple of years after that, I was poking around online and I found CrossFit, and they were really well aligned with this ancestral health model and this idea of the gym as primary health care. Like that was something that I coined really early on. I just saw it. It was like, this is the type of medicine I want to practice. So I went on to found the first and fourth CrossFit affiliate gyms in the world and got plugged into HQ, and did a bunch of work with that. And I really I can't think of a more important leverage for affecting health change than these micro gyms that have this footprint in a community that can be so profoundly life altering. They good gyms, they talk about sleep and food. They get their exercise. You've got the community baked in the cake. Like it's really amazing. But I had this. I think when you're younger, like you're kind of wanting to prove yourself. So there's some ego, attached to like kind of beating people over the head with things. But there was also this kind of a weird thing where my wife's mother, so I'm 51 now. My wife's mother died 3 months before I met Nikki from rheumatoid arthritis complications. I have rheumatoid arthritis. We've helped thousands of people with different conditions, MS, rheumatoid arthritis. We now have maybe 20 clinical studies of autoimmune paleo type approaches, specific carbohydrate diet as it applies to autoimmune diseases. We now understand autoimmune disease starts in the gut, and all this stuff. At that time, with the Paleo Solution, we had nothing to benchmark anything other than anecdote. We
Yeah.
had some anecdote. We had some stories of people seemingly reversing their conditions. And what was so crazy and so frustrating, like running the gym, and Nikki's mom, I never got to meet her, but she's just seemed like the most wonderful person, like just so incredible. And if I had met Nikki 6 months earlier, she'd probably still be alive because she was willing to do anything. So I had this like
Oh,
fire in my belly that the next person, the next person, the next person. So there was definitely like there was some, I think, some ego, but also kind of this anxiety that at that time nobody talked about this notion that your diet could dramatically influence chronic degenerative disease like this. Greg, with his focus with CrossFit and everything, was very much on like metabolic disease, which is great. It's great, reversing type 2 diabetes and all that stuff. It's great, and it's really important, and it's a huge deal. But we had this nugget of this kernel that okay, yeah, metabolic disease is important, but then autoimmune complications are like the number 3 killer of people at this point. And you could even make the case that cardiovascular disease is technically kind of an autoimmune condition
yeah,
because of the vascular and endothelial damage and all this type of stuff.
100%.
So definitely with the Paleo Solution, like I was Mach 10, hair on fire, like kicking indoors, like starting fights, but it was because there was a lot of pushback. There was nobody else talking about this message. I had this, and I don't know if this is narcissism on my part or, like a God complex or what, but I just felt like if I died and this message didn't get out, that it was going to be this huge disservice to the world. And this is worth mentioning. Lauren Cordain had found the work of an Australian physician who in the 1960s predicted the presence of zonulin, which is this enzyme in the gut. We didn't find it then. We didn't find zonulin properly until the 2000s, I think. But he predicted the existence of zonulin, that it was critical in intestinal permeability, and that it was an underpinning feature of all autoimmune disease. This was the 1960s. He had a
Wow.
couple of clinics in Australia that were helping people with autoimmune disease, and then he died in a car accident, and his information just disappeared. The clinics closed; it was gone. And then Lauren Cordain found it, but late 90s, early 2000s, and it ended up being this really kind of benchmark piece. This guy was so prescient. Like we discovered zonulin. It was exactly the type of enzyme doing exactly the type of things that this guy predicted it would be doing. It's a critical feature of autoimmune disease. Licio Fasano's work looking at celiac disease as a model of autoimmunity, like it validated all this stuff. So that was kind of that first 10, 12 years of being on the scene and pushing this stuff out there because it mattered. Like I didn't think I was crazy. I was pretty sure that I was seeing what I was seeing, but we didn't have a ton of like backup support on this stuff, randomized trials and all that stuff.
Yeah.
We're way better on that now. And there are tens of thousands of people who understand this topic. Like I could die and this thing's going to go on and it'd be okay. With Wired to Eat, what I understood was that there's a lot more nuance that is necessary paleo is awesome, low carb is awesome, but it's not necessary or appropriate for everybody. But you also need a process for kind of sorting people out and figuring out, who does need it and who doesn't need it. And so the interesting refinement of Wired to Eat, which is a way better book than the Paleo Solution was. Like, it really was, and it still is very popular among coaches and practitioners. Like, the people who read that, who are coaches and practitioners, they find huge utility out of it, because we have things like the 7-day carb test to figure out how people respond to dietary carbohydrates. There's ways of objectively assessing, like, if you have some small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or some other kind of gut related issues that could be problematic. And so Wired to Eat was this shift away from like this broad topic of paleo, and made it much more customizable for folks. And I again, it's interesting that broadly, like, that Paleo Solution book was like a manifesto. It was like this rallying cry. It was very, very successful, particularly for a first time author. Like, it's not J.K. Rowling, but like, when you look at how well that book did for a first time author in a completely unknown genre, like the paleo diet genre didn't exist at that time. Like, it's a unicorn. It's really
Yeah.
remarkable. Wired to Eat did very, very well, but not remotely as well as Paleo Solution did. And I think it's because it's not super dogmatic and has like these hard lines in the sand. It's actually like, hey, I'm going to meet you where you are, and we're going to figure out how to do some things. And ironically, I think that kind of dogmatic, over the top thing, it really works. I mean, when you look at social media, like, those are the folks that have like huge followings. Like, they have a very delineated line in the
Yeah.
sand, and like this kind of middle ground is maybe more difficult to build a really, vibrant following around, or at least a rabid following. And then the Sacred Cow, Diana Rogers and I knew that we needed to do something like that since 2010. I had my first public
Wow.
debate about the health, environmental, and ethical considerations of a meat inclusive food system at Chico State University in 2006. Like, there's still a newspaper article about this from 2006. So this has been on my radar a long time, but something that's I'll toot mine and Nikki's horns about is that we are really early to stuff. I mean, really, really early. We're pretty good at looking around corners and seeing trends, but we've been so early to things that there wasn't even an ability to have a market for stuff yet. Like, I won't bore you with details on that, but like, we've been
No, dude.
so like we developed a meat bar in our kitchen that was identical to the Epic bars. But at the time that we did this, we were looking around for co-packers. If somebody dealt with meat, they were not gluten free. If the co-packer was gluten free, they absolutely did not deal with meat. But I ended up being pretty tight with the Epic folks and helped them on a like their acquisition process and whatnot. And we showed them our kitchen notebook, like a chemistry notebook of when we put this stuff together in the kitchen. We had 3 of the identical recipes that they had. They were like, this is absolutely bang on with this thing. So like that's one of them. We had a paleo meals delivered company in 2007, and this was with John Wellborn, and it was great. It was organic. It was all the stuff. We were friends with this guy who was one of the third largest seafood producers on the planet. And so we had all this cold storage and everything, but we were just too early. There wasn't a market big enough for it yet. We were just way early. So we saw these things pop up later, like Fresh Chef and all these, like meals delivered things and whatnot, but we were just too early. But this is what Diana Rogers wanted to take my scalp for like 10 years, because she really wanted to do this book, to do this film, but I'm like, nobody's going to care. Like, there aren't enough people. Paleo FX started in 2011, 2000. Yeah, 2011. It was right. It was right at the end of 2011, because it was right before Zoe was born. I went to the very first one and spoke there, and then came home, and then she was born like 2 days later. So it was this real like white knuckler going and doing this thing. But Diana and I talked about the regenerative ag scene as a side topic in our other presentations, but it was always like paleo diet stuff. But it was maybe 2004, 2013, 2014 that we were given a small backstage to talk about this stuff. And that the following year we had the secondary stage, and then the following year we were main stage. And it was after that year that we were main stage, I was like, we can start on the book and the film now. And it took us a good 3 or 4 years to get all of the book done, all of the film done. But in that time, the awareness had grown, like Alan Savory doing his work and discussions about
Yeah.
regenerative ag and everything really started taking off. The kind of bummer is that our book released right in the middle of COVID, and so like to make the New York Times bestsellers list, they track Tuesday through Sunday to see what your sales are, and if you hit a certain threshold, then you make the list and everything.
Yeah.
We were crushing it in our pre-sales, but the Monday before the Tuesday to start this week, Amazon was out of books. They were completely out of books. And
Stop.
and some of that I kind of wonder if it wasn't somewhat purposeful because of the topic and everything, but also like Amazon was just not lots of people with book related stuff kind of got hosed during that time because Amazon was
Okay.
focusing on essentials, being able to get
Yeah.
essentials out to people. So probably not conspiracy theory, but just like super shitty timing on that thing. And so we didn't get a New York Times bestseller on that, but we had some other bestsellers, and the film has done pretty well. That's kind of an interesting topic on the film.
Yeah.
Initially, Netflix was going to make it a Netflix original, and this was going to be huge. Like, it was going to be a great payday for Diana, who really, my name's all over this stuff, but she's the person that deserves all the credit for it. Like, she got divorced as a consequence of doing the book and the film because she devoted
Wow.
so much to this stuff. Like, she bled for this thing. Like, I cannot remotely describe she's the best human being I know. Like, she's just amazing, like just phenomenal, and has bled for this deal. But Netflix was so excited for this thing, and it went all the way to the top of the food chain. We're literally at like the inking, process.
Yeah.
We're in a room. There's a phone call, and like the guy that's kind of running things is like, "Really? Like, really?" He puts the phone down. And he's like, "I'm sorry, guys, but this deal's off," and it was just done. And
Stop.
somewhere up the chain of command, somebody decided that this regenerative ag film that was portraying cattle in a favorable light, potentially favorable light, like it got killed. I mean, literally, it was kind of like I wanted to dive across the table and just like sign this and be like, it's too late, But yeah,
Whoa. Did
so
they ever give an explanation there?
no, no, but the guy, you could tell the guy was angry that this thing got shut down. He was really believed in it, was really passionate about it, got the message, got the story, got the importance, and then it was somebody higher up the food chain that just basically said, "Nope, this is done." So,
It's absolutely awful.
yeah, and I mean, in a time when like canceling was just like the thing, it was kind of PTSD inducing because we took a lot of flack out of producing Sacred Cow, and ironically not from the vegans at all. I figured we'd just get lambasted by them. If you poke around, what's interesting about that, you will not find a single negative review from like some vegan doctor, some vegan documentarian, or what have you. And I, honest to God, think it's because we did such a good job in that book and film. They don't even want people to look at it because we make a airtight case on how animals are not the primary cause of climate change, that they may actually be the pointy head of the spear in the solution to dealing with a bunch of these issues, including food security and a bunch of like social justice topics and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And we do a damn good job on it. Like, we spent 4 years working on this book, and it was my two previous books. Each time you would release them, you're like, oh, immediately, like, I wish I could update this. I wish I could update that.
Yeah.
The only thing that's happened since the release of Sacred Cow is things that we speculated on have come true. Like the fact that lab grown meat has 33 times more carbon footprint than conventional meat, to say nothing of grass fed meat. And so we speculated about that. Like I had done some back of the envelope math because I'm pretty good at physics, pretty good at thermodynamics, and I had some like upper and lower bounds on this stuff, but there were no studies at the time. So it was really speculative. So what's interesting about Sacred Cow is the case for it has only gotten stronger with time. Whereas like my diet books, like, yeah, I'd change this, I'd tweak that. There's still some continuity there, but Sacred Cow is bulletproof. And even the nutrition recommendations that we do in there, it's what we call a nutrivore or sustainivore diet, which is basically looking at nutrient density. And it's almost impossible to get an argument against the nutrient density thing. It's like, really, you should eat less nutrient dense food versus more nutrient dense
Yeah.
food, and yeah, you just go from there. So I mean, that was a really long rambling answer to your question about kind of the I mean, it's a 20-year arc,
Yeah.
between the first book and the last book and everything. But definitely a lot has changed. My perspective has changed. I think I'm much more willing to meet people where they are instead of kind of beating them over the
Yeah.
head with stuff. Yeah, yeah,
I think that wisdom comes with age, right?
yeah,
It's so interesting. But I was going through your Instagram the other day when I was like, trying to formulate questions and everything, and you posted an article on climate change
yeah.
from the New York Times with a comment, and I'm going to read this. It's kind of I just summarized this. So you basically said, extreme temperatures. This is nothing new. What is new is the weaponization and terror of this type of doom messaging. I'd love us to dive into this. So, can you expand on your thoughts regarding the way climate change is being presented and also touch on the role of censorship in shaping or perhaps stifling public discourse around critical issues? It doesn't just have to be climate change.
Yeah, yeah. And, just up front, before folks totally check out, I am not a climate change denier. I think that the climate is changing, but there's a great book by a guy, Stephen Koonin, who's a PhD physicist, and he was actually President Obama's Secretary of Energy. And he was tasked with writing a report on his thoughts around what climate change impact would mean for the United States. And so this guy's a top of the food chain physicist, very smart guy, and like the physicists, the way they're trained, they really understand systems quite well. But when he got in and he started looking at what the science said versus what the media claims were, there was
Yeah.
this huge disparity between the two. He was like, the worst case scenarios that are coming out of the academic papers are not that bad. Like when you think about what's really going to happen, none of the academic papers are saying the seas are going to boil, that the oceans are going to rise so rapidly that we can't adapt to it. It's worth pointing out that the Netherlands are 2/3 underwater. 2/3 of their landmass are underwater. They've been dealing with sea level rise for 600 years, and they've built
Yeah.
dikes and levees, and they're one of the most productive food producing nations in the EU. If
Yeah.
you give humans good information, they can solve problems like crazy. If you give people shit information, then disasters happen. And an example I would use with that is like the post Stalinist area genetics. They adopted this kind of pseudo Lamarckian genetics where it was thought that like the reason why the giraffe's neck is long is because it was reaching for food, and so its neck got longer over time. This became kind of the dominant view of genetics, and they oriented their food production around that idea. So they would take tropical plants and try to accelerate their adaptation to these environments, and it just failed wholesale. Instead of planting potatoes in cold areas, they were trying to
Yeah.
plant less cold adapted items, and it just failed, and tens of millions of people died. So I just set all this stuff up that I'm not a climate change denier, but the climate is absolutely changing. And it is absolutely within the control of humanity to adapt to this in a way that it might even be beneficial for us, because something that is missed consistently in this whole story is that if things warm up, then these areas that are currently cold a lot of the time. I live in Montana and it's quite cold in the very short growing season. The growing seasons in these areas will likely expand. And so we may end
Yeah.
up producing more food. We may end up having all kinds of other adaptations. Now, areas around the ocean, places like Thailand and Vietnam and stuff like that, they're going to face some challenges. But again, if we arm people with good information, then they will be able to adapt to this. And there have just been these pushes for everything from like forest fires to like a really hot day, that it's all climate change. And when I was growing up, I remember doing youth football, and I lived in Northern California in this little town called Redding, and it was 121 degrees during my youth football practice. We still did the
Uh-huh.
practice. Our coaches did smart things where we train for 15 minutes and then a water break. And here's kind of a funny thing. They also gave us salt tablets at each one of the water breaks. It's so that we would do
Yeah.
that in between the water that we consumed, because that was still a thing at that time. It shows just how ancient I am at this point.
Strong.
But Northern California gets really hot in the summer. Like lots of places
Yeah.
get really hot at various times of the year. And again, like if people want to dig in deeper, the Stephen Coonan book, which is called Unsettled, is really, really good. And there are pieces that have been written saying that he doesn't get it right, but it's kind of interesting. They mainly focus on character assassinations with him and like quibbling over word uses versus actually deconstructing whether or not his findings are accurate. And so you asked about censorship. I'm of the opinion, I'm one of these wacky people that I feel like almost no topic should be off limits for the appropriate
Yeah.
audience, and all that type of stuff. And if somebody is spewing bullshit, there's no better way to expose that than like the bright lights of debate and discourse
Yeah.
and whatnot. And with things like this, what's really cool, the thing of science, like Neil deGrasse Tyson said pretty recently, that the point of science is consensus. And this was appalling. This guy's one of the most renowned, scientists in the world right now. And it's a political statement, in my opinion. The
Yeah.
point of science is to create a model that provides predictive value to the world. Period.
Yeah.
Full stop. Done.
Yeah.
And if we have a predictive model, that if this model works better than that model, that's probably the better science. And so this shouldn't really the anxiety that people put forward to justify censorship is that people will be confused and they'll be misled. And my goodness, the sheep are so easily misdirected that we the all-knowing need to protect them from this information. My god, that is so scary to me. Like, I don't agree with vegans on virtually any point of their worldview, and I would be horrified if Google and Facebook and the government came in and started shutting them down. I would just be
Yeah.
appalled and horrified. But I don't see the same reciprocity coming from kind of like one side of kind of the political camp on this topic. Like, there are some folks that are really wedded to the idea that there's just thinking that is dangerous and needs to be suppressed. Dan Carlin did a show on his hardcore history. It was Common Sense, talking about in an interview study with like third and fourth year Ivy League um, law students. And basically, these students were asked, "Do you still believe in the First Amendment?" And it was like 70% of them said no. That there was that not only is speech too dangerous for it to legitimately be free, that there needs to be an intervention to make sure that people don't have wrong thought. And this is like straight out of Orwell. I mean, it's yeah, yeah, it's a lot. And when you overlay like COVID
Super fun.
and climate change and all this type of stuff, it's really concerning. But man, I've taken it hasn't been great for my career championing just trying to say it, and I usually don't come out with a real strong position one way or the other, pro climate change or
Yeah.
this or that. I mainly have just tried to say, can we have a discussion on this topic? And this has been near career suicide for me.
Well, I mean, that's why I'm asking you these questions, really, is because, and I am jumping a little bit all over the map because you are one of those people who, through things you post and say, I don't necessarily see you inserting your opinion, but you're definitely creating a space for discourse and debate, right? And asking these difficult questions that not many people are willing to go after, which I really admire. Which brings me to my last question, because I only have you for an hour and I have so many questions to ask, but there's one that I still want to ask. That is, so, how much of the current landscape in health, wellness, and agriculture is potentially compromised or at risk due to corporate interest, often disguised as altruistic helping? So, I'm specifically referring to like the Bill and Melinda Gates
Yeah,
Foundation. They have they're invested in various initiatives in these areas, and I was wondering if you could speak to the potential impact or conflicts that may arise from such involvement and how it may shape or influence policies, practices, recommendations, and free
my
speech.
goodness, that's a really good question. I don't want to be hyperbolic about this. Like I really am honest in this. All of it is compromised. Really,
Yeah.
when you get now, when I say that, there's kind of a reality that when I go interface with my local farmer, that's not compromised generally. But
Yes.
when we look to the EU, look at Ireland. Ireland is trying to take thousands of farms offline to cull millions of cattle. And the thing is that in Scotland and Ireland, there are farms that have been raising sheep and grazing animals. They have the deeds on these things that go back 2,000 years, and they're not destroyed. You know, they've been using regenerative practices this whole time, and a lot of them could actually do even better things, and they're starting to incorporate these things. And they are taking these vibrant decentralized food production systems offline, which leaves us with one option: the industrial row crop food system, which is
Oh,
completely controlled, completely centralized. And I don't want to make this political, but growing up, I always in my head saw myself as being kind of a left of center, kind of small L libertarian. Like I usually the really right wing people would be like, "Oh, you're a left wing pinko," and I would get a lot of heat from them. But it always the thing that kind of pulled me a little bit to that more left side was this anti corporatism, the anti government, like don't trust any of that stuff. I'm just floored with who I see as kind of like progressive left leaning people, and they seem to have just they can't get enough Pfizer, they can't get enough Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they can't get enough centralization in their food and their government and their education. And one thing that we've learned over time is that centralization makes for a non resilient entity. It makes for a fragile, brittle entity. And we have interesting compromises that have occurred from within and from without. China owns huge tracts of farmland. They're starting to put money into like education at the K through 12 level, and so it's really crazy stuff. So I think things are shockingly compromised, but there's kind of a reality that all of us live in a local community that does have
yeah.
broader influences that track back, but this thing is not remotely lost because we just need to go out and define the way that we are going to do this. And at a states rights level and at an individual level, when somebody comes and says, hey, we're going to shut down this food production because of a climate change shutdown, it's like, no, you're not. We are sovereign individuals. And this is what's cool, linking back to the
Yes,
element
full
thing,
circle.
we're fucking sovereign individuals. We are going to
Yeah.
live the way that we are going to live. And with an eye towards we want it to be a better place, not a worse place. Like people will bring up this red red herring thing that, oh, you don't care and you just want to destroy the environment. No, I have kids and I want them to have a better world than what I have. And if I'm wrong, then engage with me, make the case, change my mind, and you'll have one of the best fucking advocates in the world on your side. But until somebody changes my mind, I'm coming for you. Like, I am fighting you tooth and nail, because nobody has shown that, like, economics, thermodynamics, and evolution are failures. Like, when we properly understand these broad ranging concepts, things go well. And when we try to ignore these things, when we try to do pseudo Lamarckian genetics, millions of people starve to death because it doesn't engage reality. So I do think that everything is captured, but everything is also ready to be brought back, and we just have to do that at a completely grassroots individual basis. And the funny thing is, like, the big entities really at the end of the day have zero power. If we are awake and we are doing what we need to do, they have no power over us at the local level. They can try to exert that stuff, but this is kind of the benefit of dealing with governance at a local level. We know where those folks live, and they need to look us in the eye and face us. And if they're really screwing us over, it's like they need to face something, versus like some faceless bureaucrat in DC that we're never going to know who they are. We're never going to have access to them and stuff like that. So I am actually really optimistic that I think that the kind of statist collectivist scene has massively overplayed its hand. I think it's going to cause
Yeah.
massive damage. I think it's going to cause a lot of suffering. The irony is the bulk of the suffering is going to happen with the poor and the marginalized and minorities. Like, those are going to be the people that get the brunt
Yeah.
of this, like,
Cool.
bad thinking. This is the way it always plays out. But I also think that it's ours to win back, and this is where, like, uh, programs like what you're doing, where we've got a bunch of different views and people have different opinions on it and stuff like that, we can look at it and, well, what were Robb's thoughts on this? What were Mark Hyman's thoughts on this? You start looking at it and see who is good at predicting where the puck is going to go, and then we can start building models around that and kind of go with that.
Oh, Rob, this honestly, this is the perfect way to end this podcast. Thank you so
Thank you.
much for being willing to speak to me, first of all, and for just spending the last hour completely just enlightening me and the education and everything that you've given. I am so grateful.
Thank you. And again, I can spin a good yarn. I can be persuasive. What I would ask the folks that are watching this and listening: be critical. Be like ruthlessly critical. Don't believe a
Yeah.
damn thing that I said, but also vet it. Like, get
Mhm.
in and do the homework to vet. Like, if I made a claim that seems ridiculous, get in and dig that up, and then ping it to me if you want to, and let's have a discussion around
Yeah.
that. I learn the most from people asking me questions and kind of setting that course. But there's also a lot of stuff in this that when people dig into it, they're like, oh, okay, that crazy balding guy isn't so far off mark.
Perfect. Well, yeah, let's welcome any discourse, any debate. Like, we're there.
Absolutely.